Hopefully you all enjoyed the workshop. I certainly did. I think it's it's one thing to talk about this tool conceptually and how it was done and how it works. It's a completely different story to actually dive into a project with the tool in mind, and hopefully you got a lot out of it. We wanted to end on a couple different notes. One is it's all good, but how about the performance implications? What about these numbers? How about these scores, and can they relate to particular project outcomes? Do they actually improve or indicate particular outcomes? The answer is absolutely yes. We planted a little seed for this in yesterday's session. As we mentioned, we collected data from 35 projects or programs, close to $22 billion of install costs. These are completed projects. That's in addition to the other ongoing projects, some of which are ongoing right now. You can see the map that shows you 17 different states and territories where we were able to collect data from these projects. And they represent construction, defense, environmental, software, aerospace, and science. So a wide diversity of different projects. And then, if you recall, the very last thing we showed you on the software is a map or a graph that looks just like this. It didn't have all the data points that we collected on it, but it had the right thresholds at 500, 700, 800, and 1,000 there. So it had the right thresholds and it had the right colors. And these thresholds and colors are representative of statistically significant performance differences that we indeed found when we analyzed these 35 projects.
In parentheses is actually, the two scores that make up the project, right? For instance, you see P6 there in the red zone, 569 environment score and 493 on the maturity score. So that's really what you're seeing. Every one of these projects were coded by project 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever. But we also actually were able to capture, looking backwards, how well they were defined at 20% completion point on those projects.
Thank you, Ed. This helps. And again, all of these are plotted here based on their maturity and environment score, environment being on the x-axis, maturity on the y-axis. And we overlaid these with performance data for these projects at completion. Particularly when it comes to cost performance, those projects that scored above 800 on both maturity and environment did better than their baseline. So we're looking at minus 0.3%. Those that were in the yellow zone were about, on average, 13.7% in terms of cost growth. Those that were in the orange zone, we're looking at about 48% now in terms of cost growth. And these are the projects that scored between 500 and 700. And finally, if it's less than 500 on maturity and environment, if you're in that red zone, now we're looking at almost 92%, close to 100% really. So you're really looking at almost doubling what that baseline was if we're at the red.
So one thing to point out, I know we're going to get a question about it. In terms of schedule growth, orange and red, there wasn't a lot of difference in terms of schedule growth. Probably what happened there was that funds were expended to try to get on the schedule in those situations. You can see the differences between green and yellow and orange and red. So green is good.
Green is absolutely good. So they did better than the baseline in terms of cost. They did better than their estimated schedule as well, if you're above that 800. So it's a pretty telling number there. And so we didn't only look at cost and schedule, which we understand are extremely important. We also looked at some other metrics. And this is my last slide here before I turn it over to Ed. So in terms of the last few metrics, we looked at compliance. We started this whole research. The very first meeting or two were big debates about, should we focus it on only compliance or should we look at other stuff as well? We did include compliance. The projects in the green zone, were 100% of them were actually compliant. So if you're at that level, it's pretty much a lock, basically, statistically at least, that it's compliant. Even in yellow, 100% of these projects were compliant. Now, when we get into orange, it gets a little trickier. And in red, most of them were not compliant, as you can expect. Other metrics were meeting business objectives, customer satisfaction, and whether the EVMS helped proactively manage that project. These were on a scale of 1 to 5. And as you can expect, the numbers were 4 and 5 in green, getting lower to closer to 4 in the yellow zone, 3 to 4 in the orange zone, and less than 3, so 2.7 in the red zone. So as expected, these actually tracked, and that was the hypothesis there. We didn't know if we were able to prove it, but indeed, these are statistically significant numbers. Ed?
Is that what I'd say is that, you know, the numbers that you see here are good for the sample that we collected. Obviously, it's not for the whole population, so you got to be a little careful, but we were very surprised at how statistically significant these are. And, you know, the reality of it is, and I think most of us agree, if we have a good system and we have a good team, you know, in a good environment, we're going to do better. And I think that's what most of us have seen in our career. If you've had a lot of experience, you can almost smell it sometimes if it's not going well, and you kind of know why it's not going well. So these numbers just showed us what we were anticipating, but we were surprised, you know, that we were able to measure these and get the statistical significance that we got. So anyway, next slide, please. A lot of people say, well, when do we use this thing? And basically, you know, the reality of it is you can use it anytime. You can use it all the way through the execution of the project. Certainly, we just put a few places along the life cycle that you could use it. I think a lot of it depends on how long the project's going to last, the size and complexity of the project, the requirements of the client, and so on. What our recommendation is, though, is to try to use it early. And when you use it early, that shows you the gaps that you have, and you can start working toward getting an integrated project and program management system, right? And so then use it again, or use excerpts of it if you found things that really are problematic, and go back and look at those. I mean, it's really a toolbox for you to use to try to help put your project on the right path so that you can proactively manage it. And that's really what we're saying. Any questions on that as we move forward? Because a lot of people have asked that in the past. All right, we're doing good, Munir. Let's keep on going. What about your organization? Well, certainly it gives you some benchmarks. You know, at the point in time that you did the assessment, what your maturity and environment are. It can help you develop some success thresholds. We've developed them looking backwards at projects, but as an organization starts to use this moving forward, you may tweak the thresholds that you want to look at and look at the different things that really cause problems on your project. Certainly, if you're going for EVMS compliance, what we showed you is that it's pretty correlated with the compliance of the project. And it also can give you some of the insight into those things that we know that are problematic, but we just haven't been able to get our hands around, you know, the things that are really tough in the environment. And, you know, in that regard. So, you know, that's kind of the process that we go for. Next slide, please. You know, we can use it at the high level. We can use it as a risk analysis tool to assess gaps. We can use it as an approach for things that if we don't have completely all the resources we need, we can at least identify those things we want to put our effort on in the near term. And certainly in terms of the benchmarking piece of this, you know, it can help us measure against guidelines. It can help us analyze scores and so on and so forth. So just pretty much what we were talking about in the previous slide. And if you're working across different clients, it can kind of tell you how those clients approach management of the project. And that could be across an agency. You know, you're dealing with a number of different clients that make up that agency or different business units. And so it kind of gives you an idea of which ones are maybe doing the things the right way. And maybe then the help can be brought to bear on those that aren't as you move forward. Next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, I mean, the big thing that came out of this, I think it was Melissa that kind of brought it up. You know, the biggest thing that we found out is maturity is a function of environment. Almost a 1-to-1 function. An R squared of 0.71 is an extremely high R squared. in our sample, we found was that environment and maturity are highly correlated. And we know that maturity is the dependent variable and environment is the independent variable. That's the thing that we feel like really plays a big part in how successful you are as you move forward. And so, that's one of those things that popped out. This is very statistical, blah, 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 but it came out of that sample of $22 billion worth of projects. Next slide, please. In terms of some session tips, we've used this tool some in the past. The things that we've seen is, you may have different individuals in the different sessions. When you're doing maturity, you have certain people that have a knowledge of the technical aspects of the EVMS system. In the environment session, it might be more on the management side with some of the technical folks. It doesn't have to be the same group doing both the assessments. Certainly, our recommendation is to have a neutral facilitator help in that. One of the things that happens during the session is, if you've got people that are very technical oriented and we identify a gap, many times they'll try to solve that gap right there. That's not the point. The point is to identify the gap and then after the meeting, try to solve it, because we can bog down and take hours trying to solve something in a meeting. And we don't want to do that during the assessment. Remember, what you're trying to do is figure out where you are today and doing it in an expeditious manner, but a manner that's meaningful as well. So cut off the discussion if you start trying to figure out how to fix something, because that's not what the assessment's for. And then certainly if we just put this thing on the shelf and don't do anything with the outside results, then, we're kind of wasted our time. I mean, it's really the path forward that's the most important part that comes out of the entire session. Everybody has to be honest, as it says, and we're not going to try to punish anything. When I facilitate similar sessions, I always tell everybody, check your egos at the door. This is all about the project and how the project is doing. It's not about any one individual, and let's just drive on, right? I think that's really important for you to do that here. Next slide, please. All right, so summary of the tool, and then we'll have time for Q&A. It's much more useful as an integrated project management tool rather than focusing just on the score. Now, the score gives us some indication of where we are and how good we're doing and all that. But so many times in these kinds of assessments, people like to talk about the score, but not really what the results of the assessment was about. And that really gets down to those, major themes that we've identified, those gaps that we've identified, the risks that we've identified. And realize that as you're going through this assessment, you're also aligning your team around what it's talking about. So there's an alignment component that comes out of this as well. Everybody kind of gets on board and says, hey, these are really our gaps. Let's work these. Certainly up until now, when you're doing any kind of evaluation of compliance, you haven't talked about environment, or it's been kind of a peripheral thing that people kind of talk about, but that's not really a center stage type thing. This gives you the ability to talk about the environment. We've tried to identify all the issues. It's not perfect, but we've identified 27 things that make up environment. And this gives you that ability to say, hey, we've got some problems here in this area, in this area, in this area. We think that by using the tool, it'll allow you to become more consistent in how you manage and integrate your project management functions. And so, if you're more consistent, you're going to have more consistent results. And that's really what you'd like to see, rather than one wildly successful project followed by one very big disaster. It doesn't guarantee that, but it does give you consistency of at least understanding that you're going to have a disaster earlier, maybe, as you go through it. Maturity is a function of environment. And what we found was that projects with better maturity environment were more successful. Statistically, looking backwards at that sample of projects that we collected about a year ago. And so it's something to kind of keep in mind as we go forward.